Well, this morning we're going to look at John chapter 6. And in fact, the next 3 weeks I have sermons planned from John chapter 6. I'm not sure if I'll get to preach them on those Sundays, but I have them planned and halfway written, and we'll keep them. So if next week we don't have time after our business, then I will save it. And if we don't have time on Children's Sunday, I'll save it again, and we'll talk about it in September, okay? So no worries, we're not missing out on anything. But this morning we're looking at John chapter 6, and this is again a familiar story. This is Jesus feeding the 5,000. And this begins this chapter of John chapter 6 where Jesus talks an awful lot about bread. Now, I don't know about you, but I love bread. It's one of my favorites. And bread is not only something that tastes good and is filling, but it's something that regardless of where people live around the world, in some form or another, they have bread, whether it's flatbread or tortillas or bread that's risen with yeast or crackers or pasta is even a kind of bread. So bread is the foundation of what keeps us alive, right? So as Jesus begins to talk about bread and interact with bread in this chapter, let's remember that bread is not just something that's delicious, bread is something that's vital. So let's read together, or I will read and you can follow along. John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards them, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one of these people to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Hey, here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. I don't know if you've noticed, but Jesus is always blessing bread and breaking it. Just seems like if you look through the Gospels, every time you turn the page, there's another time where Jesus is sitting at a table and he breaks bread and he blesses it. And later in this very chapter, Jesus says he is the bread of life. All about bread. At the Last Supper, the bread that Jesus breaks is his very body, he says to his disciples. Jesus is recognized by the disciples on the road to Emmaus. When? When they walk along? When they talk with him? When they invite him in to stay? No. It's when they break the bread and he blesses it. Since Jesus is said to give thanks for all this bread, I went in search of information about the prayers that he might have prayed while he was blessing the bread. And I looked at some Jewish sites on the internet that have lots of good references to rabbinic literature, and they all had the same blessing for bread. It's the blessing that has been said for hundreds of years and perhaps thousands of years, and has become embedded in their culture. Embedded in the same way that some of us who have strong family ties to maybe Lutheran families or Catholic families, we have a blessing we say at the table, right? My husband has the blessing of having two strong families that say a blessing before the meal. And they're different blessings. And we looked up one, it's the standard Lutheran blessing. We tried to look up the other one, we cannot find it. We cannot figure out where it came from. But just like we have our own family traditions, Jesus, when he was blessing this bread, was not just making up words as he went along. He was using the age-old traditional blessings that everyone in his community would have been familiar with. Now, I was vaguely familiar with these Jewish blessings and prayers before I went digging, but what I learned when I went and dug a little deeper just blew my socks off. The blessing for this bread is what I was looking for, and with it I found just all of this bonus information about implications not only for the bread on the table, but implications about God and his provision in the past, and God and his provision in the present, and God and his provision for the future. Before I start down those roads, I need to say that, a lot of what I found is current modern scholarship, which is great, but these scholars didn't live at the time that Jesus lived. So while I'm sharing with you from current sources, some of what they believe or some of what they think or read into it may not be everything that this prayer meant at the time of Jesus. So now that I've given my disclaimer, I found a lot of this information on two sites. One is Chabad.org, and the other one is myjewishlearning.org. So if you want to know specific references, I'm happy to give those later. But this offering up a blessing for the bread is a long-standing tradition. In fact, it's so old, we have no idea how long this Hebrew prayer, giving thanks to God for bringing bread from the earth, has been said at family tables. In the Hebrew, it goes like this: Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, Malek ha'olam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And in English, it is, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. The first thing that stood out to me when I read this prayer is that the bread is actually not being blessed in this prayer. I'll read it again. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. God is the one receiving the blessing. God is the one receiving the praise, because it's a prayer of thanksgiving and praise to God for providing bread for us to eat. It's also a little strange because it says, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. All of the Jewish prayers at the table are similar. Okay, so it says, who brings forth fruit from the trees, or who brings forth fruit from the earth, or who brings forth fruit from the vine, or who gives us every good thing. But I don't know about you, I've seen vegetables grow out of the ground, and I've seen fruit grow on trees, and I've seen fruit grow on vines. I have never seen bread grow out of the ground. And this elicits all kinds of rabbinic debate, because they recognize that this is a little strange. They recognize that this is a little strange to say that bread comes forth from the earth, springs up from the ground. Rabbinic scholars debate over this, and for some it means that the bread is a reference to literal trees of bread that grew in the Garden of Eden. Which, I don't know, that's an amazing imagination and creativity at work in coming up with that solution. They said, in the Garden of Eden, there must have been bread trees. And they reference not just this prayer, but they reference the scriptures where God says to the man, when giving out the curse, that now he will have to work by the sweat of his brow for his bread. So if there was bread in the Garden of Eden, where did it come from? Their solution? It grew on trees. Other rabbinic scholars believe that this is a reference to a future age where we will be relieved of the curse and where God will freely provide bread and sustenance for everyone without toil and labor and sweat. Either way, I'm afraid those of us here have become awfully detached from just how hard bread is to come by. Today, most of us just walk into a bakery and buy bread, but everywhere in antiquity and in a lot of other places in the world, farmers first plow the earth using implements drawn by animals. They plant seeds by hand, and then they anxiously wait and pray for rain, without which there will be no crops. Even if the grain does grow and ripen, then they have to reap it and sort it. They have to make sure that there's no pebbles and rocks. Then they have to beat it, thresh it, and then they have to winnow it and let the chaff blow away, leaving just the grain itself that can be ground into flour. And then they sift the flour, and then, and only then, can it be mixed with other things and baked into bread. It reminds me a little bit of that children's story, the little golden book story, the little red hen who plants the seed, but she can't get her friends to help. And she grows the seed, but she can't get her friends to help. And she harvests the wheat, and she can't get her friends to help. And she takes the grain to the mill to be milled into flour, and she can't get her friends to help. And then when she bakes the bread, and everybody wants to help her eat it. We look at this process and the hard work that goes into it to create these loaves of bread. And today, I'm afraid, it's just real easy for us to be the friends who come over when we smell that smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. Well, the rabbis, when they look at this and they debate amongst themselves, they're dividing time into 3 specific time periods. A time in the mythical past when everything was perfect, just like Eden. When bread growing on trees could be consumed without labor. They look at the reality of time right now, when bread has to be worked for with difficulty, and sometimes we're lucky to have food at all. And then they look at a hoped-for time to come, a messianic age, at the end of days when paradise would return, just as in the days of the Garden of Eden. Now, according to this rabbinic thought, when those people are holding the bread in their hands and they're blessing this bread, when they're giving a praise and a blessing to God, they believe that no one is actually referring to the bread that's in their hands, that bread is just a symbol. For some, they believe this bread refers to manna that God provided in the wilderness. For some, they think that it's this reference to bread that came easily in the past. And some, they believe, is a prefiguring of this messianic age to come. And when I read all of this, I had to sit with it for a while. It's a lot of information, and a lot of it sounds different to anything that I'd ever read before or that, maybe we've ever studied before. This blessing that they're saying is much more than just a vote of thanks for daily food. It's something that constitutes a statement of faith. Faith in a time to come when we will all have enough to eat, when we will be free from backbreaking work that's required for most of the world's population just to put food on the table. They say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." It's a promise. So if Jesus was blessing God for providing bread in the past, whether it's through manna or the bread that sprang effortlessly from the ground in paradise on bread trees, and if there was any thought of looking forward to the messianic future when bread would be provided from the hand of God without human toil. Then it puts a whole new spin on this story of feeding the 5,000. I had to ask myself, could Jesus in this moment have been proclaiming himself Messiah? To those who were gathered on that hillside, first by giving thanks to the bread, and then by multiplying it to meet their needs. Some on that hillside certainly thought he was doing something. Because of the way that they responded, they said, "Here is the prophet who was to come." They didn't proclaim him Messiah, but Jesus had to get out of there before they made him king by force. Messiah means the anointed one. One of the messianic duties was to become king and to free his people from oppression. They wanted to make him king. They were trying to make him to be the Messiah they expected, the one they hoped for, and the one they dreamed would rescue them from the Romans. This miracle was big. Not only in size, not only because there were 5,000 people gathered on that hillside, it was a grand gesture. Jesus was showing that he was sent by God. But let's not forget all of the different and various ways that Jesus literally and figuratively claimed to be ushering in the reign of God on earth. He healed the sick, like Isaiah said he would. He cast out demons and set people free from spiritual bondage. He claimed to be the Son of God. And he said, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I've studied these signs and declarations, and I've written countless papers and sermons about them. But I never imagined that Jesus could have been proclaiming himself Messiah in very small ways. At every meal. At the Passover. And on the night when he shared a final meal with his disciples, holding the bread in his hands and saying, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." And I wonder if we too can conceive of ways, large or small, that in our everyday lives we can usher in the Messiah's kingdom in radical ways and in the very mundane of our existence, by breaking bread and blessing God, by daily committing to follow this Messiah and continuing to look forward to a day when we will break bread at a feast that none of us toiled for, at a banquet of grace, a banquet of mercy and love, a table open and welcoming to all of God's children. How will we begin to live this reality of God's rule and reign? Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven has come. And if you and I are followers of Christ, we have proclaimed that Christ's kingdom has come into our very lives. How will we begin to live in the reality of God's reign in our lives and in our world? I want to pray this morning these same words that Jesus prayed, these same words that our Jewish brothers and sisters have prayed for thousands of years. I want to give thanks to God for the grace that we do not earn, for provision in the distant past, and for confidence that God will continue to provide justice in the age to come. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth.